Welcome to the Teacher Incentive Allotments presentation on teacher observations for TIA. This presentation will focus on strategies to get valid and reliable teacher observation data. The objective of this webinar is to identify best practices to ensure valid and reliable teacher observation data. While the information in this session will be useful to any districts looking to improve their teacher observation calibration practices, for the purpose of TIA, this information will be most useful to districts who are currently collecting teacher observation data, which is cohorts A, B, and C, or districts who are currently designing their local designation system, which is cohorts D and beyond. Let's start by taking a look at a snapshot of data from two different appraisers at the same Texas school. On the left of each graph, you can see that the appraisers are observing the same dimensions in domains 2 and 3 of Ttest. You may notice that appraiser 1 has rated far more teachers as distinguished than appraiser 2. Additionally, appraiser number 2 has rated far more teachers as improvement needed than appraiser number 1. While it's possible that appraiser number 1 is observing more effective teachers, a more likely analysis of this data is that they are rating teachers in different ways. One appraiser may be inflating scores, while the other may be rating teachers too harshly. It's impossible to know which rater is right without doing more digging, but a likely analysis of this data is that a teacher would likely get a higher rating from appraiser 1 than from appraiser 2. Let's take a look at another snapshot of data. This time, the data comes from two different schools in the same district. On the left, you can see their campus accountability scores for 2 consecutive years. The graph shows the percentage of teachers scored at distinguished, accomplished, proficient, developing, and improvement needed. Here, you can see that campus A is lower performing, but they have more distinguished ratings. Campus B is a much higher performing campus, but they have far fewer distinguished ratings. While campus A is lower performing than campus B, their observation data is much higher. This could be because they hired some very effective teachers and the data has thus increased from 1718 to 1819. But it's also possible that campus A has inflated observation scores. The point we want to highlight is that any measure of teacher effectiveness has to lead back to student learning and growth. There should be a correlation between academic data and observation data. And when there isn't, we need to do some digging. So why does it matter that we get teacher observations right? There are many reasons that ultimately all lead back to increasing student learning. However, for the purpose of TIA, we want to call out 2 big reasons. First is in order to measure teacher effectiveness fairly, we must evaluate their teaching accurately. The best teachers should get paid the most, not teachers who happen to have been assigned a certain appraiser, work at a certain school, or teach a certain subject. The second reason is that an effective strategic teacher compensation program fundamentally relies on teacher trust of the system. Teachers must believe that their observation data is an accurate reflection of their skill as a teacher. Otherwise, compensation will seem arbitrary or unfair, and ultimately could yield the opposite of the intended effects of TIA, higher teacher turnover, and further inequitable distribution of effective teachers. During this time, we'll share best practices for teacher observation with the lens of what is happening at various points of the year. This is a snapshot of what the entire school year should look like in terms of actions that will yield highly calibrated teacher observation data. Notice that at the beginning, the focus is ensuring that appraisers are well trained and ready to observe teachers. Just as teachers are using data to plan their instruction, district leaders should use observation and student growth data to determine strategic areas of focus for the year in terms of calibrated observations. The middle of the year is a cycle of appraisers observing teachers, leaders then analyzing observation and student growth data for skew and correlation, and then leaders retraining and developing appraisers as a result. This should be viewed as a cycle of development rather than a one-time training. Finally, the year ends with more data analysis before starting the cycle over again. Before we talk about best practices, let's make sure we have a common understanding of 2 key terms that are often mixed up. Validity is the extent to which something measures what it claims to measure. Does our rubric measure teacher effectiveness? This question is an easy one to check off if your district is using one of the approved rubrics. This includes Ttest, Danielson, NIET, and Marzano. If your district uses something else, you'll need to spend some time investigating whether your rubric aligns to Ttest. We won't spend time today talking about aligning rubrics, but know that we are planning an upcoming session for districts on this topic. Validity can also be impacted by how appraisers use the tool. If they don't have the knowledge or skills to use the rubric, the results will not be valid. Reliability is the extent to which results are consistent. Will a teacher be rated the same way no matter who their appraiser is or where they teach? Because appraisers in a single district have such varied experiences and personalities, the default is that appraisers will vary in how they use an observation rubric. Unless we are thoughtful, strategic, and persistent in working toward alignment and scoring teachers, there will be skew. In other words, teachers' observation scores would depend on who their appraiser is, what school they teach at, or what subject they teach, rather than how effective they are as a teacher. Let's start with best practices to implement before the year begins, which is summer through August or September for most districts. The 3 benchmarks that should be happening before kids come back to school is analyzing last year's observation data, making a strategic plan to address any problem areas, and then certifying and calibrating your appraisers. Let's dig into each of these. The first best practice that should happen before the school year gets rolling is taking a minute to step back and ask the question, how are we doing with teacher observations? How valid and reliable were our teacher observation scores last year? There are 2 big questions that we ask when we're analyzing teacher observation data. The first is, where is there skew in our district? And the second is, where is there a lack of correlation between observation data and student growth data? Notice that I didn't say, is there skew or is there correlation? We can assume that there is, but districts with really strong teacher observation systems work to identify and reduce skew and lack of correlation continuously. I also want to add that while we're talking right now about analyzing teacher observation data as a best practice at the beginning of every school year, it's a good idea to go through this analysis process before you build the teacher observation component of your local designation system. Let's take a look at the first question we need to answer. Where is there skew in our data? Skew is the extent to which data leans one direction or another based on some factor, such as school, grade level, subject, etc. We want teachers' observation scores to be impacted only by their level of effectiveness. This chart shows Ttest averages across 4 elementary schools in a district and across the 4 main teaching assignments in those schools. For folks without an elementary background, specials means electives. As you can see, there are multiple areas of skew represented here. Generally, the specials teachers are rated much higher than the math and science teachers. Maybe this makes sense or is explicable because perhaps the specials teachers in this district are generally more effective. Or perhaps the district is inflating the specials teachers' scores. Additionally, notice that Buttercup Elementary is generally rating all their teachers much higher than other schools. This is possible skew, and district leaders would need to do some digging to determine if this is explicable or inexplicable. Let's take a look at the analysis that Snapdragon ISD did before the start of the school year. First, they decided to check for skew by campus. We can immediately pull out that Campus E and Campus G aren't very aligned to the other campuses. Campus E's average is 3.0, Campus G's average is 4.0, which is 0.5 points lower and higher, respectively, than most of the other campuses. So, Snapdragon ISD's next step should be to figure out if there's a good reason for this. Is the skew explicable? What Snapdragon decided to do is they compared Ttest averages with that same year's accountability ratings. They saw that School E, which had lower Ttest scores than everyone else, also had the lowest rating of any school in the district. Similarly, Campus G had the highest Ttest scores, and they also have the highest accountability rating. Given the context they have about the schools themselves, this Ttest average actually made sense. Their check by campus is done. Now they're going to check by appraiser. Here are the average Ttest ratings for each of Snapdragon ISD's elementary appraisers. Most appraisers' average is around 3.5, but Williams' average rating is 4.5 and Rodriguez's average rating is 2.5. This skew may or may not be explicable. Snapdragon ISD needs to ask more questions to find out. Does Williams mostly rate very effective teachers? Does Rodriguez mostly rate less effective teachers? If not, these appraisers may need additional training and calibration. They repeated this process to look at their middle school appraisers and their high school appraisers as well. Once their check for skew by appraiser is finished, next they'll look at skew by subject. Here are Snapdragon ISD's average ratings on Ttest by subject. When they cut the data this way, they could see that PE, fine arts, and foreign languages were rated much more highly than the others. They realized that there is almost certainly a problem of skew here because they knew that this group of teachers as a whole was not more highly performing than the other groups. But they wanted to ask a follow-up question, which was, are our teachers who have a STAR test rated similarly as teachers without a STAR test? So they cut the data that way, and here's what they found. There was a huge discrepancy generally between how teachers with and without STAR tests were rated. This is actually a fairly common problem, and there are many reasons why this may be happening. In some districts, appraisers have a lot of experience in what excellent math or reading instruction looks like, for example. But generally, fewer appraisers know what it looks like for band teachers to be highly effective, or welding teachers, or foreign language teachers, especially if they don't speak the language being taught. These are very real obstacles that need to be addressed in order to ensure that a teacher is fairly evaluated. Snapdragon ISD decided to include some additional appraiser training this year that looks specifically at tough-to-rate courses. They decided to develop a PD in which appraisers determine what each level of proficiency looks like in, say, a dance classroom. Their check for skew by subject is done. Lastly, Snapdragon ISD decided to check for skew by grade level. They found that the two youngest grade bands, pre-K to first and second to third, were scored higher than all the other grade bands. So they looked at the student growth data coming from these grade levels and did not find that students were growing more in these grade levels than in other grade levels. And so they decided this is an area in which they need to target. Snapdragon ISD has finished their skew check, and three big target areas emerged. The first is there are a couple of grade level bands that they need to focus on, pre-K through first and second through third. The second is they need to focus on non-STAR tested teachers and ensuring that those teachers are rated accurately. And finally, there are a few appraisers across the district who need to be retrained and recalibrated. Next, they'll check their observation data for correlation to their student growth data. First, let's talk about what we mean when we say correlation. Correlation shows the relationship between two factors. A positive correlation means as one factor goes up, the other factor goes up as well. That would be a positive correlation. With student growth and observation data, we want to see a positive correlation. As teacher observation scores increase, the percentage of students meeting their growth target in that teacher's class increases as well. Take a look at these two graphs. You can see that at Bluebell High School, for example, a teacher had an average of 2 on Ttest, and 60% of that teacher's students met their growth target. We can see that at Bluebell High School, as teachers' Ttest scores increase, so does the percentage of students meeting their growth targets. On the graph, the data points generally move up and to the right. In comparison, at Yellow Rose High School, there does not appear to be much correlation between a teacher's Ttest score and the percentage of students meeting their growth target. Notice how one teacher had a Ttest score of 4.5 and 40% of that teacher's students met their growth goal. Let's compare that to this teacher whose Ttest score was 2.0 and almost 80% of that teacher's students met their growth goal. Something isn't adding up here. Your goal is for your district's observation data to look more like Bluebell High School's data than Yellow Rose's data. A useful term to know when we're talking about correlation is correlation coefficient, or R. Correlation coefficient describes how strong the relationship is between two factors. In this case, the relationship between teacher observation ratings and student growth ratings. A perfect positive correlation has a correlation coefficient of 1. A perfect negative correlation has a correlation coefficient of -1. Because many other factors also impact student growth, for example, student mobility, districts should aim for a correlation coefficient of at least 0.24, which represents a moderate positive correlation. In order to determine how strong the relationship is between student growth ratings and teacher observation ratings, districts can calculate the correlation coefficient using a spreadsheet application such as Microsoft Excel and the correlation formula, as you can see on the spreadsheet on the left. This set of data has a correlation coefficient of approximately 0.48. This represents a moderate positive correlation. Here's a graph that represents this data set. As teacher observation ratings increase, student growth ratings increase as well. A common question we receive is, if our teacher observation data and our student growth data are not correlated, does that mean we're rating teachers inaccurately? And the answer is maybe, but not necessarily. Your ratings could be valid, but your student growth measures may not be. When you see a lack of correlation, you need to examine both teacher observation ratings and student growth measures to find the root cause of the problem. Okay, let's go back to Snapdragon ISD, who already completed their check for Skew. Take a look at these graphs comparing teacher observation data and student growth data at each school level. Think about what you can conclude from these graphs. The elementary and middle school teachers have positive correlation between student growth data and teacher observation data. Looking at this graph, there does not appear to be much correlation between teacher observation scores and student growth data at the high school level. There are two possible reasons that this could be happening at the high school. The first is potentially teacher observation ratings aren't valid or reliable. And the second is student growth measures may not be valid. They also decided to take a look at correlation by STAR-tested classes versus non-STAR tested classes, since this came up as a problem area in the Skew check. And sure enough, there was a lack of correlation when comparing non-STAR tested teachers' observation scores with their student growth data. After completing the check for Skew, as well as their checks for lack of correlation, 3 big areas to target emerged. The first was inexplicable skew in a few areas, in pre-K through first and second through third grade level bands, among non-STAR tested teachers, and among a few individual appraisers. They also found a lack of correlation with their high school teachers and a lack of correlation with non-STAR tested teachers. After your district has analyzed last year's teacher observation data, the next step is to create a plan to address the problem areas. Great plans start with clear, measurable goals. Here's one example. This goal targets a potential problem of elementary appraisers being inconsistent. The goal is, on 85% of elementary intercampus co-observations, appraisers are calibrated. Here, calibrated is defined as appraisers matching each other on 80% of ratings. We'll get more into calibrations later. Once you have clear goals to improve your teacher observation practices, decide which actions will help your district meet these goals. These actions might take place at the beginning of the year, throughout the whole school year. Here are a couple of examples of strategic actions. Facilitate additional appraiser training to build the skill of rating elective teachers, implement inter-campus calibration walkthroughs, and there are more. We'll share more ideas in the during the year portion of this training. Let's take a look at part of the plan that Snapdragon ISD made in response to their data dive. This part addresses the problem of non-STAR teachers' observation data showing skew and lack of correlation to student growth data. Their focus is to increase the validity and reliability of teacher observation data in non-STAR courses. To measure success, here's the goal they wrote. When comparing non-STAR observation data to student growth data, the correlation coefficient is 0.24 or higher. The key actions they've planned to drive this goal are to provide supplemental PD to build skills in rating hard-to-rate non-STAR courses. They plan to increase the number of observations for non-STAR teachers. They also plan to ensure that each non-STAR teacher is rated at least once by someone besides their main appraiser. And then finally, they also plan to implement additional actions related to creating stronger student growth measures. As you're considering how to implement an observation data analysis dive, you may be wondering where you can get similar reports for your district. Most observation management systems offer teacher observation reports and welcome requests for reports that don't yet exist. Ask your data management provider if they can create an observation report to view observation ratings by appraiser, campus, teaching assignment, and grade level. If your data management system does not offer correlation reports, you can create these graphs and find the correlation coefficient using Excel. The TIA team is planning future training on this topic in the near future. Many districts use DMAC to manage their teacher observation data. DMAC is able to run many different reports, like this one that looks for Skew by Ttest dimension. DMAC also invites districts to request the ability to run reports that don't yet exist. Similarly, Eduphoria, another commonly used data management system, can run many different types of observation reports. This report, for example, looks at Ttest dimension 2.2 and shows the percentage of teachers that are rated at each level of effectiveness at 3 different schools. It's easy to see on this graph that there may be a lack of calibration between campuses here. Finally, TA offers a free Ttest management system at teachfortexas.org. Here you can run a number of different reports to compare Ttest averages by campus, appraiser, subject, and grade level. Additionally, we're always looking to add features and reports that would help districts increase their observation calibration. Here's one report that you can run using this system. This line graph compares arts teachers versus ELA teachers and reading teachers by Ttest dimension. After you've done a deep analysis of the teacher observation data and created a strategic plan to address the problem areas this year, it's time to certify and calibrate appraisers. According to statute, appraisers must be certified every 3 years, but we recommend certifying appraisers annually. If your district is using Ttest, your bases are covered. If not, the next slide will share some important keys to ensure that your certification process is meeting the goal of calibrating appraisers to the rubric and to each other. Appraisers who are certified less than 3 years ago will need to calibrate at least annually. So every year, all of your appraisers are either being certified, recertified, or calibrated. Calibration should include a refresher crash course on using the rubric and collecting high-quality evidence. It should also include a performance calibration task. Videos work well for this since you may not have teachers back in the classroom when you do this training. Can you certify and calibrate more often? Absolutely. Many districts choose to certify annually and calibrate quarterly. This is a great practice. You may also choose to include some supplemental training for all or some of your appraisers. For example, Snapdragon ISD decided to include some additional training to target the skills behind rating non-STAR courses, like band, for example. This is also a great opportunity to share your data analysis with principals, appraisers, and teachers, and share the plan for improving teacher observation reliability and validity. If your district doesn't use Ttest, your appraiser certification and calibration plan should include a few things. It should define what every component of the rubric looks like at each level of teacher effectiveness and across multiple contexts. For example, what does an indicator look like at proficient in a kindergarten classroom versus a 12th grade AP foreign language class? It should establish a shared understanding of what high-quality evidence looks like. It should train appraisers to identify their own bias and how that may impact their scoring of teachers. And last but not least, it should include lots and lots of practice. We recommend using videos as a way to give appraisers practice rating teachers, since teachers may not yet be back on campus. We do have a partnership with NIET where you can access teaching videos to use for calibration purposes. I'll speak more about this in a moment. They should also be able to compare their ratings to an expert's ratings. And just like students learn best with lots of teacher feedback, appraisers also need lots of feedback as they're working to build the complex skill of rating teachers. Remember, rating teacher effectiveness is a challenging skill. Taking time on the front end to build and maintain appraisers' skills is probably the most effective way to ensure that your teacher observation ratings are fair. Finally, I want to add a plug for a rubric alignment workshop that is coming live to districts in January. If your district is using a district-created rubric, I want to encourage you to come to this workshop so you can help ensure that your rubric is aligned to Ttest. In November, we'll post a district-created rubric crosswalk document that you can also use to ensure that your rubric is aligned to Ttest. TIA has partnered with the National Institute for Excellence in Teaching to give Texas districts access to their Educator Effectiveness and Support Systems Portal, or EPASS Portal. Let's take a look at how districts might use this resource. You can access it by going to our website, tiatexas.org, and clicking on NIET EPASS under the Resources section. Next, click on the green Click to visit the NIET EPASS Portal button. You will need to register for an account, but accounts are free. In the portal, click on Menu at the top left of the home page. Here, you will be able to access the content library. While there are many resources we want to encourage districts to explore here, we'd like to highlight that you can search for videos of teaching by subject or grade. If your district, like Snapdragon ISD, has identified skew in teacher observation scores of non-STAR tested subjects, for example, you may decide to have your appraisers get extra practice by watching this 6th grade band lesson, scripting evidence, and assigning a rating on Ttest or whatever rubric your district is using. By clicking on the video, you can find Ttest ratings and supporting evidence. This can be used to calibrate appraisers or as a tool to deepen the understanding of how to use Ttest. At this point, your district has analyzed the previous year's observation data, you've created a targeted plan to increase your observation calibration, and you've trained and certified your appraisers. Now it's time to jump into the school year. During this portion of our time together, we'll unpack some of the best practices that schools and districts can implement from roughly September through May to ensure valid and reliable teacher observation data. As a reminder, this is what the flow of the year should look like. We've unpacked the first phase, which is data analysis and appraiser training. The middle of the year is a cycle of appraisers appraising and district leaders using data to develop and retrain appraisers. The first best practice is frequent observations. Statute requires 45 minutes worth of observations per teacher during the year. However, for highly valid and reliable data, best practice is to observe multiple full classes so the appraiser can see a variety of teaching moves during different parts of the lesson. Like everyone, even highly effective teachers have days in which their teaching practice isn't as strong. If an appraiser is watching them teach regularly and rating their performance, the average rating is much more likely to represent their consistent skill over time. Also, if you only have one data point for each component of the rubric, it's unlikely to be an accurate representation of the teacher's practice over the course of the year. Best practice is to collect ratings on each dimension at least 2 to 3 times. Additionally, we recommend conducting both scored and unscored observations, and for some of those scored observations to be announced and others to be unannounced. We also recommend having multiple appraisers observe each teacher to prevent and catch bias in ratings. This last recommendation is admittedly tough for many districts, especially our districts with only one appraiser. Coming in November will be a webinar that will share guidance on how small districts can make this work and many other best practices. Second, throughout the year, district leaders should analyze the observation data in the same way that they did at the beginning of the year. They should check for correlation between observation data and student growth data. They should also check for skew between appraisers, campuses, grade levels, content areas, etc. And those data reviews should be shared with campus and district leaders. Strong, regular data review will allow them to implement the third mid-year best practice, which is regular calibration and appraiser training in response to the data. Calibration should be both a tool to evaluate appraisers and a tool to develop them. There should be calibration practices that are simply meant to build appraisers' expertise with the rubric, their ability to collect strong evidence for a rating, and their ability to link teacher moves to student learning. There should also be periodic checkpoints when an appraiser must demonstrate that they are still able to rate aligned to an expert rating. A best practice is to schedule calibration checkpoints each quarter or each semester. There are many different activities districts use to both ends. Ideally, co-observations, whether in person or using video, happen between appraisers at one campus from different campuses, from different contents, and involve district leaders. Calibration activities could include campus walkthroughs, co-observation, one-on-one coaching of appraisers, and formal professional development. In the next few weeks, we'll be releasing some print-and-go calibration protocols to support districts in implementing their strong calibration practices, such as this single-dimension walkthrough calibration protocol. Check our website for these resources. Finally, and this is a best practice that overlaps with the other best practices, I want to add a quick plug for using videoed observations. When videoed lessons are scored, the ratings are often much more defensible, and they may yield more valid results for a few reasons. First, videos decrease the observer effect and give the appraiser a more authentic window into the classroom. Videos can increase validity because they decrease appraiser distraction. Most appraisers are also responsible for many other things across the school and may be easily distracted during an observation, which then impacts the validity of ratings. Videoed observations help mitigate that obstacle because appraisers can simply pause the video or even rewatch a portion. Finally, videoed observations for the purpose of scoring can be empowering to teachers if they're permitted to choose what to record and share, which creates more buy-in around their observations. You can also use videos, as I've mentioned earlier, for the purpose of calibration. Getting appraisers from across the district to one place can be a logistical nightmare, so videos can be a convenient way to make sure everyone sees and scores the same lesson. Remember that teachers should opt into being filmed. Check your district's policy on this. Let's put all of this together. Here's one example of what this could look like. Meet Alejandro, who is an assistant principal and a teacher appraiser. Sheila, who is the principal of Alejandro's school and his manager. And Carrie. Carrie is the school's superintendent. Let's look at what each person on this team does throughout the year to make sure teacher observation data is highly calibrated. Let's start with Alejandro. Alejandro completes one 45-minute observation and 4 15-minute observations per year for every teacher he manages. Some of these observations are announced and some are unannounced. He also shares feedback and observation ratings with teachers promptly after the observation. He completes video calibrations quarterly to help him stay calibrated to the rubric. And finally, he participates in monthly co-observations with his manager, Sheila. The purpose of these are to both calibrate him and help him grow in his ability to implement the rubric. Let's take a look at what Sheila does. Sheila facilitates monthly co-observations with Alex. They focus on 3 to 4 dimensions of the rubric each time and discuss why they rated the teacher the way they did. She also helps Alejandro create an observation schedule that allows him to observe each of his teachers 5 times this school year, 1 long and 4 short. And finally, she reviews observation trends on our campus monthly and checks for correlation to student growth data quarterly. What does this look like at the level of district leadership? Carrie visits a different campus every Wednesday to participate in walkthrough observations with the campus leadership team. She also meets with Sheila and the other principals monthly to review observation trends across the district. Finally, she facilitates quarterly district-wide comparisons of observation data and student growth data. For some people, it makes sense to them to think about strong observation systems in terms of a timeline, what's happening during each part of the year. For other people, it's more helpful to think about this in terms of roles and responsibilities, or who is doing what. And now we've arrived at the end of the year. At the end of the year, districts should take time to analyze observation data from the entire year to determine where skew existed, where a lack of correlation between student growth data existed, and how to improve teacher observation practices next year. And the cycle continues to repeat itself. The TIA team is always looking for ways to support districts who are implementing or designing their local designation system. So every single month, you should find more resources on our website related to teacher observation calibration. In December, we'll post a recorded webinar with guidance for small districts on observation calibration. In January, we'll host a live training to support districts in aligning their rubric to Ttest. We'll also post a few documents over the next couple of months, including informational one-pagers, calibration protocols, sample year-long calibration timelines, and a rubric alignment checklist. Currently on our website, you can find a recorded webinar with guidance on teacher observations during virtual learning. We encourage you to check it out. Thank you for watching this webinar on teacher observations for TIA. If you have additional questions, we encourage you to check out our website, tiatexas.org, or email us at tia@tea.texas.gov.